Well, welcome, ladies, to our second annual Spring Tea at Compass Tustin. Isn't this a great morning? Are you guys happy to be here? Say thank you to your hostesses. Say thank you to the woman who invited you today, because these ladies were up early this morning, getting here, getting this room set, setting the stage, setting their tables. But we are just so glad that each and every one of you could join us this morning, especially on such a busy weekend, right? Mother's Day. I mean, we've all got like a gazillion things going on. And if your husband is like my husband, you probably get asked the question every Mother's Day, what do you want to do for Mother's Day? And for me, I have to actually fight against saying, I just want peace and quiet to sit on the couch and read a book. I don't say that. I say, I want to be with my family and go do something fun. But if I were being really, really honest, I just want to sit and read, because anyone that knows me knows that I'm a nerd and a bookworm. But one of my favorite books that I've ever read is a book called The Boys in the Boat. Has anyone heard of it? Has anyone read that book? Okay, great. I've got a few that have read it. It's a fascinating story about true historical biography, all about the boys of the 1936 Olympics that went over to Berlin and represented the U.S. as our rowing team. And they actually won gold at that Olympics. It's this incredible story. And I got to tell you, I never knew that rowing was so interesting. I mean, you're reading pages and pages of the author describing the intensity and the grit and the perseverance and the mental and emotional and physical strength that it takes to be a rower. And to be a rower, at first the collegiate level, this team participated, and then they went on to the world stage at the Olympics. And as you're reading this story, you're thinking, why on earth would anyone subject themselves to this? This sounds awful. The author describes at one point that the amount of strength and physical exertion that it takes to row for 6 minutes, which is about the average time of a race, in that span of time, these men exert about the same amount of energy that it would take to play 2 complete rounds of basketball, like 2 complete games of basketball, is exerted in the same amount of time of the 6 minutes of rowing. And so it's just crazy. Why would these guys do that? But the author also goes on to explain that this group of men set their sights on Olympic gold. First, they set their sights on making a name for themselves at the collegiate level, and then they got the opportunity to go and to race to represent America. And once they had that in their sights, everyone in the boat was committed and driven and focused, and everything in their life was centered around this one single end goal of crossing that finish line first and getting the glory of the gold. And as I've been thinking a lot this past few months, actually, about the woman that I'm going to share with you guys about today, I see a lot of correlations with her story and with theirs. But the difference is in her story, she didn't set her sights on Olympic gold. She set her sights on crossing the finish line of life, and of living life with an eternal perspective, knowing that in the end, it wasn't going to be a gold medal she received as her reward, but rather an eternity with Jesus and the treasure that would await her if she lived a faithful life for him. So Jesus, when he was here, he actually had something to say about this. In Matthew 6:19 through 21, he said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And I'm going to tell you the story today about a woman from church history who lived with that in mind. Well, it was December 16th, 1867, and David held his wife Catherine's hand as she bore down and gave birth to their first child. They lived in a gray stone house on the northern coast of Ireland. And that night when that child was born, it was a girl. And David and Catherine named her Amy Beatrice Carmichael. Amy quickly became the oldest of 7 children. And as oldest siblings typically do, she was the ringleader of the bunch. Amy was incredibly smart and incredibly stubborn. So for the moms in the room, you know that's a great mix to have in an oldest child, right? Smart and stubborn. When Amy set her mind to do something, she did it, and there was no talking her out of it. At one point during her childhood, when she was being particularly disobedient, an adult was disciplining her and was explaining to her how naughty of a little girl she was. And Amy recalled later in life that she thought at that moment, if you only knew how exceedingly naughtier I could be, you wouldn't think I was naughty at all. So even in that, she apparently had some level of self-control. Amy grew up in a Christian home. David and Catherine were committed to teaching all 7 of their children the Bible. And with teaching them the Bible, they taught them all about God and how God is our creator and that he's powerful and almighty and that he can do anything. And Amy really believed that her entire life, so much so to the point that when she was 3 years old, she thought, I'm going to pray the biggest prayer that I know because I know that God can do anything. And so she knelt beside her bed that night and she prayed, God, please make my brown eyes blue. She climbed into bed that night with the utmost confidence that she would wake up in the morning with her mother and not her father's, but blue eyes instead of her father's brown eyes. Well, sure enough, the morning dawned, and Amy jumped out of bed, pushed a stool over to the mirror, climbed up on top, and stared into the same brown eyes she had when she fell asleep. She later recalled the complete sense of shock when she discovered that sometimes God answers our prayers with no. But Amy grew to deeply appreciate that God hadn't answered that juvenile prayer that day. He had a very specific reason for creating her with brown eyes. Well, Amy's parents didn't only devoutly teach her the scriptures and devoutly teach her the importance of prayer, but Amy's parents were diligent to teach her the gospel. And in the gospel is really the whole story of the entire Bible. Amy's parents taught her that we are all sinners and that our sin has made a separation between us and between a perfect and holy God. That's the bad news that Amy learned. But the good news that Amy learned all growing up is that God is love. And because he is love, he himself came down, took on human flesh, lived a perfect life that we could never live, died the death that we as sinners deserve to die by taking that punishment on himself. And then not only that he miraculously rose from the grave, showing that he is God and that he conquered sin and death. Amy grew up learning the facts of the Bible. She knew the gospel, as we call it, the good news. But her life was never changed by it until one day when Amy was about 17 years old. And it was at this time that Amy and her siblings were walking out of church. And as they walked out of church that day, they happened to practically run into a very old woman who was exceptionally poor. And this old woman was struggling under the weight of carrying a large bundle of sticks and firewood. And so Amy and her siblings, being the good kids that they were, offered to help her. Well, they offered to help her thinking that maybe she was going right around the corner, but they ended up following this woman for blocks and blocks and blocks as she led them to her final destination. As they were walking the streets that day, Amy grew increasingly embarrassed. She could feel the redness creeping up into her cheeks as she and her siblings, who were of an upper level of society, were seen trotting behind this old poor woman carrying all of her sticks. But in that moment, because Amy was so well taught by her parents, the scriptures, and she even had much of the scriptures memorized at that point, the words of the Bible came rushing back to her mind, and they were so clear in her mind that she felt like it was almost as though someone was verbally saying them to her. And the words of scripture that Amy remembered in that moment is 1 Corinthians 3:12 through 14. And this is what it says: Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. Amy was confused. She didn't quite understand, why are these particular words of scripture? I can't get them out of my mind as I'm carrying this load behind this widow. And it bothered her and it sat in her heart so much that as soon as she got home, she actually went and locked herself in her room and just tried to think and discern and pray and went back to the Bible to try to understand, what do these words mean? Well, after examining the scriptures and praying about it, Amy came to realize that what the Bible was saying is that things that are not done for Christ are not going to last. The things that we do that are not done for the glory of God and for the glory of Jesus out of love for him are not going to last in eternity. And Amy realized in that moment that she needed to make a decision. It wasn't just knowing the facts of the Bible that was good enough. She needed to actually choose to have a response to those facts. And when Amy thought about all that she knew that Jesus had endured to take on the wrath of God on our behalf, Amy realized that really the only logical explanation she had was to give of her life as an offering back to him. So it was that very day that Amy gained her eternal perspective. Amy decided to stop living life for herself and to start living a life that was fully devoted to God and only chasing after and pursuing the things that he prioritized, the things that would matter in eternity. Well, the Bible tells us that when someone becomes a Christian, they are made a new creation. And Amy's sort of mantra or motto that she carried with her for the rest of her life after that day was this: nothing is important but that which is eternal. She knew that nothing else was important. And this radical change that happened in her from the inside out by becoming a true Christian, a true follower of Jesus, was incredible. And her sisters even started referring to all of Amy's newfound passion and exuberance as Amy's enthusiasms. One group that Amy was particularly enthusiastic and passionate about was women and children. Well, Amy immediately got to work trying to figure out how can she take this passion for making sure that everyone knows the good news of the gospel to multiple people. And she ended up teaming up with a man named Dr. Montgomery. And what the two of them would do is they would go walk the streets of Ireland, and especially into the slums, and they would hand out little booklets, gospel tracts, little booklets that they could hand to people that would explain what Jesus has done for us. Well, it was on one of these days when she and Dr. Montgomery were handing out these booklets that suddenly Amy saw a small child. And Amy was drawn to this child because she didn't know why the child was standing there alone, but suddenly what looked like a very old, bent over, hunchback, kind of deformed body looking woman came and scooped up the little girl. And Amy was watching all this happen thinking, oh goodness, is that woman okay to hold that baby? She doesn't look well. But as the woman turned around, the shawl from her face fell, and it revealed the face of like a 20-year-old young woman. She wasn't an old woman at all. She was a young woman. And Amy was shocked and thought, what kind of life must this person have lived in order to make her look so hunched over and so like she had lived a hard life? So as they were going home that day, Amy inquired of Dr. Montgomery, do you know who that was or where she came from or what her life looks like? And Dr. Montgomery said, yes, I know exactly that sort of life that she lives. That girl is one of the girls that works in the mills. And these girls work hunched over their work in the mills for 10 to 12-hour days. And so they did, in fact, get hunchbacks, and their spines would be kind of deformed because of how they were hovering over their work for 10 to 12 hours a day. Well, these women were also paid very poorly. They were paid so poorly that they could barely afford food on the table, let alone a warm coat or a warm hat to wear out in the winter. And so what they would do is they would take their shawls and wrap it around their head as protection. And thus, these women were referred to as shawlies. Well, Amy could not stop thinking about the shawlies. She wanted to help them. She was so compassionate about their situation and where they were in life. And she wondered, when are they going to church? When is anyone caring enough about them to tell them this good news of what Jesus did? So Amy went to her pastor and she asked her pastor, would it be okay if I set up a little Bible study that I could reach out, invite these women in, and host a Bible study where I could do that very thing. I could teach them about the Bible, I could teach them about Jesus, and just invite them into the church. Well, her pastor agreed, and so that's exactly what Amy did. She started grabbing these shawlies off of the street and inviting them to join her for a Bible study that she led once a week at the church. Well, when other members of the congregation found out or ran into in the church lobby people of a much lower level of society than they were, they had a little bit of a problem with it. Not everyone, but some people got their feathers a little ruffled. But Amy and the pastor stood their ground, and they said, it doesn't matter what level of society people come from. We are all created in God's image, and every single one of us deserves to be able to hear the message of the Bible and the good news of Jesus. Well, over the course of 2 years, Amy continued to pour herself into this ministry of reaching out and grabbing these women and bringing them into the church. But sure enough, as time went on, this little Bible study that young Amy Carmichael, at that point probably about 19 years old, was leading, grew to the size of 400 women. That's like double the women that are in this room right now over the course of 2 years. And so at that point, Amy realized, oh, okay, I really do need to go find another place that we can host this, and maybe even a place that I could have 24/7 access to, that I could have ministry going on for these women all the time. So Amy began to pray. She didn't say anything about this to anyone. She simply began to pray. And within a few weeks of her praying, God, where do you want us to go? What do you want us to do? Where should I go with this ministry for this women? She got a letter from a woman named Kate Mitchell. And Amy had previously known Kate. In fact, Kate was a very wealthy heiress that lived in the area. And Amy had previously told Kate about her work with the Shawleys. And Kate was so intrigued and so moved by Amy's work with them. But it wasn't until several months later, when Amy was in this predicament, that a letter arrived from Kate. And in that letter, Kate told Amy that she wanted to buy a building for Amy to be able to have 24/7 ministry for this group of women. Amy was over the moon. She knew that this was such a direct answer to her prayer because she hadn't told anyone about it, especially not Kate. All she did was pray and ask God to provide, and he did. Well, as soon as she had the money for the building, she started looking for a plot of land that she could build a building on top of. And sure enough, she ended up finding a plot of land on Cambria Street. She did her homework and tracked down who it was that was the owner of that land and inquired if he would be willing to sell it. Well, he wanted to know, what are you going to use it for? So again, Amy launched into the whole story with all her enthusiasm and all her passion about the work that she was doing with the Shawleys, and the landowner was so moved by what she was doing, he told Amy, not only will I sell you the land, but I will only sell it to you for 1/10 of its value. Amy then realized that the gift that Kate Mitchell had given her was enough not only for the building, but also to purchase the land. So with that, Amy ended up buying a prefabricated aluminum building that was kind of like a building in a box. It arrived and they kind of constructed it and put it together on this plot of land. And she named it the Welcome. But the people in the village affectionately called it the Tin Tabernacle because it was built out of aluminum. Amy ended up putting flyers all over the city and in every newspaper that she could, this advertisement: Come one, come all to the welcome hall, and come in your working clothes. Amy was finally able to give these women a place that they could come and be comfortable just as they are, with no one being concerned about how they were dressed or how they smelled after a 10 to 12-hour day in the factory. They could come and be comfortable. Well, as was in Amy's nature, she got right to work with pouring herself out for the sake of these women. She had activities, multiple activities, going every single day. And not only was Amy concerned about teaching these women the Bible, but she was also concerned about meeting their practical needs. So if you actually, in several of the books, there was like little flyers that actually had all of the day's activities on it. And it's such a beautiful blend of both Bible teaching and meeting practical needs. Amy did everything from teaching them how to play musical instruments to singing practice, sewing club, a meeting specifically ministering to mothers, a meeting specifically ministering to girls, night school so that they could learn other things to hopefully get them out of the mills, and obviously Bible studies. Well, while things at the Welcome were just ramping up and moving full steam ahead, things at the Carmichael house were not so prosperous. A couple years before, Mr. Carmichael had actually died. But before he died, he had taken pretty much all of his money and placed it into an investment that would continue to shell out money to his family once a month. Well, unfortunately, a few years later after his death, that investment went bad, and all of the Carmichael's money was lost. So Mrs. Carmichael gathered her children in one day and explained to them the situation, that they had nothing to live on and she didn't know what was going to happen. But like the great mother and spiritual mother that she was, she gathered her children together and she brought them before the throne of God, and they prayed together. They prayed that God would give them guidance, that God would provide for them, and that God would show them what it is they were supposed to do next. Well, just within a couple days of the family praying that prayer, a letter arrived from England. And in this letter was an old friend offering Mrs. Carmichael a job in England that would meet all of their needs. But funnily enough, he also had a proposition for Amy. He wrote in the letter that if Amy would also come with her mother to England, that he would pay and support her to be able to set up a ministry with the factory workers over in England like she had done with the Shawleys. Well, obviously, Amy was in complete turmoil. She was left having to choose between these hundreds of women that she had worked for years with and had built this ministry serving, and going with her mother and starting from scratch. And so she prayed and asked God to show her what it is that she should do. Well, ultimately, Amy decided and felt that it was the best thing to do for her to go with her mother to England. And so, through tears and heartache, she had to say goodbye to the women that she so dearly loved, and to the Welcome and all of the ministry that was going on there. But God was so faithful to provide. As Amy stepped out, he brought someone else in, and it was none other than Kate Mitchell, that wealthy heiress who had originally given all the money so Amy could have this building in the first place. Over these years, she had become like Amy's right hand, and it was she that stepped into the role of director when Amy moved on to England. Well, upon her arrival to England, Amy got right to work trying to minister to the Shawleys and the mill workers and the factories that lived there. But rather than going and living with her mother in the nice part of town, Amy actually made the decision to live among them in the slums. Amy subjected herself to some of the most deplorable conditions imaginable. She would sleep in this room that was just rat and cockroach infested. And in fact, she made it a priority that every night before she got in bed, she would either bring a book or a boot and set it beside her bed. And when she woke up in the morning before she got out of bed, she would pick up the book or the boot and slam it against the floor so that all the little critters would scurry back to their hiding places before she got out of bed and turned the light on. It was not uncommon in those times when she was living there for Amy to feel cockroaches and rats scurrying across her blankets in the middle of the night. But Amy did this because she loved these people. She wanted to be there to be able to be their friend, to teach them the Bible, and to help them in any way that she could. But ultimately, it was Amy's love for Jesus, and her goal, her eyes were set on eternity. And because of that, she knew that whatever little discomfort she was facing in that moment was nothing compared to the scope of eternity and the glory that awaits with our Savior Jesus. Well, unfortunately, while she was living in these awful conditions, she ended up contracting some kind of disease. And we aren't even 100% sure of what exactly she had, because at this point it was around 1890, and doctors in those days just didn't have the technology or even the knowledge to really be able to accurately diagnose like we are today. And so, what they diagnosed her with was something called acute neuralgia. And this was a very broad term for everything from a migraine to stomach cancer. So who knows what Amy actually was suffering from. But the common prescription that doctors would give patients in those days with that diagnosis was one of these three things: good food, rest, or a change of climate. But in Amy's condition, she was in such bad shape that the doctor looked at her and said, "You need all three." Well, Amy did not know how she was going to get all three of these in just one answer. But again, God was so faithful to provide for her. He provided for her by the name of a man, Robert Wilson. Robert Wilson was a widower, and the Carmichael family had actually met him like 3 to 5 years previously when he had come to Ireland for a missionary meeting. And they had met Robert Wilson and invited him into their home. The children all loved him, and he had become especially interested in Amy's work with the Shawleys. Well, when Robert Wilson heard that Amy was in such bad shape, he reached out and said, "I would like you to come live with me in my manor in the Great Lake District of England," and it was named Broughton Grange. Well, Amy wrote back to the dear old man, as the children had affectionately called him, or the DOM, and said that she would love to be able to come and rest up and heal up. So again, she had to say goodbye to the people and the ministries that she loved so much and go and move so that she could get better. Her goal in moving there was only to rest up and heal, and then she immediately wanted to return to her work with the Shawleys and the mill workers and the factory workers. Well, as Amy started getting stronger and stronger and recovering from whatever disease it was that she had, she started realizing that this dear old man needed a lot of help. He needed a lot of help in his home, he needed a lot of help in his ministry, and he needed a lot of help organizing something that he was overseeing called the Keswick Meetings. The Keswick Meetings were for missionaries, aspiring missionaries, or it was even for missionaries to come back and give reports of what was going on overseas. So it was a very mission-minded organization. Well, as he was doing that, he needed someone to help him with writing the letters, organizing the events, and even hosting the missionaries, finding places for them to be able to stay, or even inviting them into his own home, and he needed someone to be a hostess. Well, Amy jumped right into that role and began helping this dear old man, as she called him. But that wasn't the only thing that Amy did. Because as I told you, Amy's heart and passion was for women and children. And so Amy walked the neighborhood and invited the women of her neighborhood to come and join, women and children of her neighborhood, to come and join her for a weekly Bible study. So again, Amy started a weekly Bible study at Broughton Grange that started growing and growing and growing. Well, after about 3 months of living with the dear old man, he came to her because he could see she was starting to get much better and much stronger, and he said, "I know that you want to go back to the Shawleys, but your work and your ministry here is important. Will you please stay with me and live here indefinitely?" Well, Amy was torn because she had always planned on going back to live with the Shawleys in the slums. But again, Amy was faithful to spend some time praying and thinking about it. And in the end, she felt that she really was right where God wanted her to be. And so she agreed to stay on and live at Broughton Grange as the dear old man's assistant to his ministry, but also the hostess to his home. And so a year at Broughton Grange quickly passed. Then one day, kind of seemingly out of the blue, Amy was going about her work, and she recalled a staggering fact that she had learned years before from the renowned missionary Hudson Taylor. And she remembered hearing Hudson Taylor speak and remembering that he said that there are 4,000 Chinese that die every hour, having never heard the gospel. And even though Amy had heard that like 5 years before, she suddenly could not get it out of her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about it. And so, as Amy always did with everything, she took it to the Lord in prayer. She spent one sleepless night just sort of wrestling with God in prayer, saying, God, what do you want me to do with this? Why can I not get this off of my mind? Why am I suddenly so burdened by this fact that I heard years ago? Well, when Amy emerged from her bedroom that next morning, Amy knew exactly what it was that God wanted her to do. He wanted her to go. Amy was really kind of scared to have to tell the dear old man and her mother that she felt called to go and be a missionary. She knew how much each one of them was depending on her and loved her and what a rock she was for both of them, and she was scared of causing them any heartbreak. But in the end, Amy set her sights again on eternity and realized that it was more worth it for her to be pleasing to Jesus and obey him than it was for her to be pleasing of man. And so with that thought in her mind, Amy let her mom and the dear old man know that she was going to be going and applying to be a missionary. And sure enough, the dear old man and her mother were heartbroken. But they both also loved Jesus, and so they encouraged Amy and said, we are heartbroken, but go. If that's where God is calling you, then go, and you have our full support. Well, because the call to missions had first come to her through that message that Hudson Taylor gave, Amy thought, what better place to start than with Hudson Taylor's ministry, which was the China Inland Mission. And so in January of 1892, Robert Wilson accompanied Amy to London, where she could formally apply for the China Inland Mission. As Amy sat down to fill out the first form that day, the dear old man leaned over, grabbed her hand, and said, you had better write Amy Wilson Carmichael there, so that everyone will know you have meant as much to me as any daughter could. From that day on, she went as Amy Wilson Carmichael, for she also loved that dear old man just as much as any daughter could love a father. Well, unfortunately, Amy's application with the China Inland Mission didn't go very far. The doctor took one look at her, looked her up and down, and said, no. She looked way too weak of a woman to be able to travel overseas, which was hard enough, but then to also be exposed to all kinds of illnesses, typhoid, dengue fever, yellow fever, all of these things that he knew she would be exposed to, and he didn't think she would be able to survive. The doctor's words were final, and he said no. But it was just like Amy, with her stubborn and determined spirit, not to let one doctor deter her from what she believed God was asking her to do. And so she immediately began praying and asking God, if China is no, where is it that you want me to go? She spent 4 months praying and thinking about where it was that she was supposed to go be a missionary. And finally, she felt like she was being called to Japan. The problem was she didn't know anyone in Japan. She didn't know any missionaries in Japan. She hadn't even heard of any missionaries in Japan. So she went back to the dear old man, who, remember, was very connected in the missionary community, and she told him, I think God is calling me to Japan. Well, the dear old man knew exactly of the right people to get Amy in touch with. So he wrote a letter to a missionary couple who was already stationed in Japan doing great work over there. But Amy, being Amy, was so convinced that this is what God had for her, she didn't even wait for their reply. She bought a ticket and was hopping on a ship to take her to Japan because she was so confident that this is where God wanted her to be. They did write back and say yes, by the way. They did end up wanting her. So she was able to say goodbye to her mother before she left, but the dear old man absolutely insisted on accompanying her all the way to the dock. And so Amy boarded the ship that day. She stood on the bow of the ship, and the dear old man stood on the dock, and they called out scripture to each other as the boat was pulling away from the dock to try to encourage one another. Tears were streaming down Amy's cheeks as she saw the dear old man getting smaller and smaller and smaller. She was for sure thinking that there was no way she was going to be able to stay aboard that ship, because everything in her wanted to jump in the water and swim back and just hug the dear old man, because they loved each other truly like father and daughter. Her grief in that moment was so intense and so real that decades later, Amy said that when she recalled that moment, she could still feel that intense grief of that moment. She never got over the loss that she suffered in saying goodbye to the dear old man that day. But again, Amy's love for Jesus and for the gospel was greater than any person. Well, the voyage to Japan lasted a full 6 weeks. So on May 1st, 1893, Amy finally arrived on Japanese soil. But unfortunately, her time there was very short. Amy was barely there for about 12 months before she did, in fact, get very sick. She was becoming weaker and weaker and weaker, and she went from spending hours in her bed to days to weeks in her bed. She also began experiencing fainting spells. And so finally the missionaries called the doctor to have them come take a look at her. And the doctors diagnosed her with what they called Japanese head. And it was a very broad term that they used for anyone that was experiencing dizziness, fainting, or just general weakness. Well, the one known cure for Japanese head was to get the head out of Japan. And so Amy realized that she was, in fact, going to have to go home. Well, in God's providence and sovereignty, at this very same time, Amy received a letter from Robert Wilson's son. And in the letter, he was begging her to come home because the dear old man had just suffered a stroke. And he was continually asking and begging someone to go get Amy and bring her back. So it was in that moment that she rushed back to England to be by the dear old man's side. Well, she did exactly as he wanted, and she helped nurse him back to health. And she ended up staying in England for a few more months, trying to figure out what to do next and where to go. She still was 100% convinced that God wanted her to be a missionary. And so when she was there in England, she received a letter from a friend of hers that was a missionary in India. And in this letter, her friend was describing to her the great need for missionary women in India and how dark that place was at that time. She also described that the climate of India was very mild. It never got too cold, and it never got too hot. And so her friend thought that this place would be an excellent place for ministry, for Amy, even health-wise, to be able to do ministry. Well, Amy prayed about it and ultimately decided that's where she was going to go. So again, within 3 months, she was back on a boat, waving goodbye to the dear old man on the dock. This time, she had just celebrated his 70th birthday with him, and with his declining health and deteriorating condition, and her knowing the long journey that was ahead of her and the opportunities that awaited her in India, she knew that this was the last time she was going to see him. And so her heart broke, and that grief came back all over again. But what Amy didn't know that day, and probably no one else in her family even could fathom, was that this would also be the last time that Amy ever crossed an ocean. Because once Amy arrived in India, she never left for the rest of her life. When Amy first arrived in India, she had a really hard time acclimating to the culture. Not the Indian culture, but the missionary culture. Amy was realizing that she and the missionaries that she was partnered up with had a really different philosophy of how to go about doing things. The missionaries that she was teamed up with really wanted to keep everything English, and so they wore English clothing, they only ate English food, they kept all their English customs, and they only spoke English. While Amy, on the other hand, deeply desired to learn the native language, which is the Tamil language, and she desperately wanted to remove any barriers that would be between them and the people in order to be able to tell them the gospel. Well, as this friction between her and the others kind of grew and grew and grew, right when it got to the point that Amy thought that she couldn't take it anymore, Amy met a couple by the name of the Walkers. Thomas Walker and his wife were also missionaries in southern India, and it turned out that Thomas had long had this desire to start a band of traveling missionaries that would kind of go all over southern India and tell people the gospel. Well, as they talked and got to know each other, Amy realized that she had found awesome ministry partners in the Walkers, and the Walkers realized that they too had found an awesome ministry partner in Amy. And so they asked Amy if she would like to come live with them and join their missionary work. They promised that they would, together with her, build this team of missionaries that would move around, and they also promised to teach her the Tamil language. So Amy was all in. It wasn't long before Amy was getting a good grasp on the Tamil language that she decided she wanted to do something which was actually kind of frowned upon at the time. She wanted to go fully native. And what that meant is that Amy wanted to abandon everything English about her in order to take on all the identity of being Indian. She wanted to wear a sari. She wanted to speak in Tamil as much as possible. As I said before, Amy didn't want there to be any kind of barrier in between her and the women and children that she was trying to get to know in order to tell them about the Bible. Well, that first time that Amy wrapped her sari around her, she looked in the mirror and realized that with her brown hair and her brown eyes, she did, in fact, blend in very well with those around her. And it was in that moment that Amy praised God for his sovereignty and his providence in making her just as he saw fit so that she could do the work that he had called her to do. As Amy put on her sari that day, she prayed that it would have the exact effect that she wanted, that this would be the thing that broke down barriers so that she could have a better relationship with the people that she was trying to minister to. Well, right around this same time, as Amy was getting the good grasp on the language and as she adopted wearing the sari, she started praying. It was time for her to form her band of evangelists that would partner with the Walkers to go around and tell others about Jesus. And so she began praying and asking God to provide women who would be willing, Indian women who would be willing to step out and do this, which was a very tall order. But God, who is always so good to do so much more than we could ever think or ask, provided not one, not two, but 3 Indian women who came alongside Amy and were willing to step out of their cultural roles and even put their own lives on the line by going around and evangelizing to people all over southern India. Amy and her band of women called themselves the Starry Cluster. And the Starry Cluster did exactly that. They would have the same approach to pretty much every village that they went to, and it was this. As soon as they got to a village, they would break off in pairs, 2 over here and 2 over here in the marketplace. And they would just sit and wait and pray. And they would pray and ask God that he would bring women to them that they could have conversations with. And sure enough, God was always faithful to bring women to them. And as soon as the women came to them and started talking to them, and the women realized that they were Christians, the questions just started pouring out from these women about the Bible and about Jesus. So they would spend their whole mornings having these conversations with the women just in the marketplace, not having any appointments, not having any meetings, just being there and making themselves available. Well, around lunchtime, they would get back together and head back to a camp that they would usually set up kind of like on the outskirts of the village. They would eat lunch, they would have a time of they would have a Bible study, they would have a time of prayer where they prayed specifically for all of the women that they had talked to that day, and then they would head back into the village and basically hold like an open air meeting where they would just start singing and preaching and teaching to anyone that would listen. The men could not care less what a woman had to say, but the women would stop, and the children especially would stop and listen. This was hard, exhausting work that the Starry Cluster was doing, but none of them ever complained. They were so excited to be pouring themselves out for Jesus. Amy wrote, "Only the eternal is important," and she proved that day in and day out by continually sacrificing herself and her time and her energy in hopes that these women would hear the good news and turn from their sin and place their trust in Christ. A couple of other people ended up joining the Starry Cluster, but kind of for different reasons. There were a couple young ladies in their very early teens who had decided that they wanted to become Christians. But making this decision to become a Christian at that time in India was setting yourself up for a ton of persecution. And sure enough, as soon as these two girls separately announced to their families that they were Christians, their families kicked them out. Their families didn't want anything to do with them, and so they were left homeless and kind of abandoned by their family and any other relatives. And so they went and sought out Amy and the Starry Cluster for refuge, to become a family to them. Amy welcomed them with open arms, and so now her little party of 4 became a party of 6. Well, news of Amy accepting these young women and kind of taking them under her wing quickly spread all throughout southern India. And news of her and her infamy spread so far and wide that it even crept into the crevices and the dark places of the Hindu temples. You see, in those days, children were often given to the temples as a gift or an offering by their parents. Their parents would give their children over to the temple as a way to earn favor with the gods. And in the temple, these temple children, the priests would raise them until they got into a certain age. And at that point, the priests would perform a ceremony where these children would be married to the gods. And after that, they were expected to perform a life of worship to the gods, which was being temple prostitutes. The age that this ceremony typically took place for these temple children was anywhere between the ages of 7 and 9. Well, there was a little girl living in the temple, and her name was Preena. Preena's father was dead, and her mother had given her to the temple just for that very reason, as a way to earn back favor with the gods. When Preena was 5 years old, she tried to run away. She ran 20 miles as a 5-year-old back to her mother's house. And she was certain when she got there that her mother would welcome her with open arms and protect her from the temple women coming and getting her. But Preena was wrong. The exact opposite actually happened. You see, to take her daughter back now, in her mom's mind, would be stealing from the gods. And so when the temple women returned seeking Preena, her mom handed her back. Preena was terrified, and rightfully so, because when they got her back to the temple, they burned her hands with iron as a way to remind her to never run away ever again. Well, it was now 2 years later, and Preena was now 7 years old, and she was very aware that her marriage to the gods was coming up very soon, and she was scared. Right around this time, the temple women started hearing all these stories of Amy and the Starry Cluster. And Preena was so intrigued by who this woman was. She takes girls in and becomes a mother to the motherless. She's telling people about someone named Jesus. Who is this woman? Well, the temple women tried to scare Preena because they didn't want her to run away again, and so they actually started telling Preena scary stories about Amy. But Preena would have none of it. All Prina knew is that there was someone out there who she believed would protect her. One night, Prina was laying in bed, and she suddenly woke up. She was completely alert, even waking up from a dead sleep, and she had this intense feeling that she needed to leave now. It was so intense that this little 7-year-old got up in the middle of the night, tiptoed again out of the temple, got to the temple gate, and gently pushed on it. She was fully expecting for the gate not to give at all because she knew that every single night the temple was locked up and secured, and there was typically no way to ever get out. But on this particular night, she pushed on the gate and the gate swung open. Prina then looked to her left and to her right for any guards that would be roaming the grounds looking for anyone escaping or anyone trying to come in. But she looked to the left and to the right, and there was no one. So Prina ran. She ran all the way until she got to the next village. And once she got to the next village, she didn't know what to do at that point, so she just kind of roamed the streets until she found the village church. And then because it was so late at night and nobody was there, seemingly, Prina just went and stood on the steps of the church, not really knowing what to do or where to go. Well, she was only standing there for a few minutes when the door of the church swung open, and out walked a woman named Servant of Jesus. Yes, that was her name. Servant of Jesus walked out. She took one look at Prina and immediately recognized this little girl belongs in the temple. But at this point, it was so late at night that to take Prina back through the 2 villages and across the bridge was going to be way too dangerous. And so she told Prina, "You can come home with me tonight, but first thing in the morning, I am taking you back to that temple." Because if she would have kept her, it would have been putting her own life on the line. Well, that whole night, Servant of Jesus did not get any sleep because Prina did nothing but beg and nag and plead with her not to take her back to the temple, but to take her to Amy. She would not let her sleep all night long, and so finally, by the time the morning dawned, Servant of Jesus had it up to here. And she told Prina, "Okay, little girl, I will take you to the Starry Cluster's house, but listen, I know that they are out evangelizing. They're not even home. So I will take you by their house just to stop your nagging so that you can see that they're not home, and then I'm taking you back to the temple." And so there they walked at 6:30 in the morning, mind you, because Prina could take it no longer, and neither could Servant of Jesus. They walked over to Amy's house. Servant of Jesus fully expected that they would show up to a vacant home. But when they rounded the corner and the house came in view, there was none other than Amy herself, sitting on the steps, drinking her morning tea. As soon as Prina saw Amy, she let go of Servant of Jesus' hand and she ran to her. She climbed up into her lap, threw her arms around her neck, and just clung to her. Amy didn't know what was going on, but she realized that this was a child that was in desperate need of love and protection. And so Amy wrapped her arms around Prina, and there the 2 of them sat, looking like long-lost mother and daughter. Well, it wasn't long before the temple women came looking for Prina, and it wasn't long before the people in the village told them that she was staying at Amy's house. And so the temple women, along with 200 of the villagers, showed up at Amy's house demanding that Prina go back with the temple women to the village. As this showdown was going down, Prina, this little 7-year-old, who turned out to be just as stubborn as Amy herself, came and stood in between Amy and the temple women. And she put her foot on the ground and she told everyone that she was not going back to the temple. She told everyone that she belonged with Amy and the Starry Cluster now, and nothing was going to make her go back. Well, Amy and the rest of the house had to endure quite a few days of harassment from the temple women, from the people of the village, trying to get Prina to come out and go back with them. But Amy and Prina were not budging. Neither one was going to allow Prina to go back to the temple. Well, within a few days, miraculously, the crowds died down and they kind of gave up. harassing them. But the temple women did come back, and they warned Amy, if you will not give Prina to us, we will go back, get her mother, and have her mother come and take her from you. So the starry cluster and Amy and Prina waited and waited and waited for this day to come when the temple women, maybe the crowd, Prina's mother would come back again. But you know what? The day never came. No one ever came back looking for Prina. And so it was settled. Prina belonged to Amy, and she began calling her Amma, which is the Tamil word for mom. Well, as word continued to spread about this English woman that was harboring young girls and teenage girls, saving them from either the temple or from being unwanted and rejected, Amy found that both young women and babies were being brought to her. In the course of 3 months from the time that Prina arrived, Amy found that 3 more young teenage girls were coming to her, and 4 babies were brought to her. So Amy suddenly, in the course of 3 months, found herself caring for 8 children. Amy realized that this somewhat nomadic lifestyle she was living with the starry cluster really wasn't working, as she tried to then tow all 8 kids along with her. And so she approached the starry cluster and she said, I think I need to settle down. I have these children that God has entrusted me to take care of, and I can't keep dragging them all over the place. Well, the starry cluster agreed, and so they began praying, as they always did, about where God wanted them to go and what God wanted them to do. Well, no sooner had the group started praying about it than they received a letter from none other than Thomas Walker. And he was writing to let Amy know that he had just received a very interesting offer. There was this property in the city of Donover, and on this property was a very large Bible school. The teacher of the Bible school had left, and so they were reaching out to Thomas Walker, asking him if he would come not only be the teacher, but also be kind of the overseer of the whole grounds. Well, there were several, it was a huge property, and there were several large vacant buildings at this place in Donover. And so Thomas reached out to Amy and the starry cluster and her children and asked, would you guys want to come live with me? Well, it was kind of a no-brainer for Amy and the rest of them, and so there they all went off to Donover. Once they arrived in Donover, the other 3 women of the starry cluster would continue to go out and do that evangelism, but Amy never left her children. She always stayed home, making sure that they were being well taught the Bible, that they were being taught their manners, and that their basic needs were being cared for. Well, the longer that Prina was with Amy, the more and more horrifying things Amy would hear about what was going on behind those temple walls. Prina explained that it was not only parents giving of their children to earn favor with the gods, but also that even older girls were sometimes given to the temple if husbands couldn't be secured for them, as a way for their parents to sort of get rid of them and not have the girls be their problem anymore. Amy was sickened and horrified by all that Prina was telling her, and she was desperate to find some way to redeem these girls out of that darkness and bring them into the light, and to tell them all about Jesus and show them how to live a life of obedience to him. Well, the way that she did that is that she started writing letters to missionaries, pastors all over India. And she sent these letters telling them that if they rescued any girl from the temple, that she had a home for them at Donover. Over the course of 2 years, the children in Amy's care grew from 8 to 17. And those 9 extra girls that were brought to Amy, 6 of them had been rescued from the temples. With each new soul that arrived at Donover, though, that meant more and more work to be done. Amy and the starry cluster were now caring for 17 children, and the amount of work, as most of us know, that goes into caring for one child is quite exhausting. But they were caring for 17 and growing. The washing, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the teaching, the hugs, the kisses, everything, the sweeping, everything that was needed to care for these 17 souls was absolutely exhausting. But every time anyone in the Starry Cluster, or even Amy herself, grew weary of the work, Amy would remind them and herself of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And she would tell them, if our Lord can wash the dirty, nasty feet of the disciples, surely we can serve these children that he has entrusted to us. By 1906, Amy's ministry had grown to 60 people between the children that were in her care and the staff that she needed in order to be able to care for them. Amy was constantly looking for more Christian men and women who would join her in the task at Dohnavur. As the years went on, the fellowship grew and grew. Sometimes Amy would hear of a child in need, but that child had no way to get to Amy. So Amy herself would, again, wrap herself in her sari. She would take coffee, rub it all over herself to dye her skin darker so that she could travel the dusty roads a little unnoticed and go and get these children and bring them back to safety. Amy would travel hundreds of miles on foot over the dusty, hot landscape of India just to rescue one child. It was more than worth it for her. And it was on those trips that she found herself again and again praising God for not answering that juvenile prayer request of giving her blue eyes because of how well she was able to blend in with all those around her. By 1912, the fellowship was now at 120 people. The work was exhausting as Amy diligently cared for not only the children, but also the staff. Amy found that she was continually having to refresh herself by reading the Bible, by prayer, and by ultimately setting her sights on eternity. You see, Amy always worked with the mindset of knowing that the time that we have on earth is so short, and she didn't want to waste any of it being unproductive for God. And so with that continual eternal perspective in mind, she continually poured herself out for this ministry. In 1931, Amy's team was now quite large, and they had found an abandoned building kind of on the outskirts of town. And they had come to Amy and said, we have this abandoned building, and we think that it would be really great if we could convert it into a pharmacy, not only for us, but also for the village. And so they took Amy out there that day to come and to explore this building to see if that would work. Well, as Amy was taking a tour of the building, she failed to see a huge ditch that was in front of her in the middle of the building. It was narrow, but it was very deep, and Amy fell right into that ditch. That day, she broke her leg, she dislocated her ankle, and she twisted her spine. Amy was rushed to the hospital, but in those days in India, they just did the best that they could, but Amy was never the same. In fact, when she arrived back to Dohnavur that day after her injury and she walked into her bedroom, she and the rest of the staff could have never imagined that she would live the last 20 years of her life as a shut-in in that bedroom. She was so physically disabled by that injury and by the lack of care that she received that she was never able to come out of her bedroom and walk around the grounds ever again for 20 years. But Amy knew that God had a plan. Even though she had to be practically bedridden and had to now be served hand and foot, this smart and stubborn woman who had spent so long pouring herself out for everyone else, she now had to graciously accept the help of others. It was really hard for her. But Amy knew that God knew what was best for both her and the people that were caring for her. And so she accepted the circumstances that God had put her in with a joyful and happy heart, and she used her time wisely. As Amy laid there in bed, she began to write like crazy. Amy had actually always been a writer. She had now actually been what they were now calling the Donover Fellowship. She had been there for like decades, and through that time, she was writing stories of the children that were coming to her and sending it back to the publishers. So Amy had actually already several books that were published. But in those last 20 years of her life, as she was in her bed, she wrote 14 books. She also continued to completely manage and oversee all of the happenings at the fellowship. And by this point, as the fellowship was at like 400 people by now, she also made sure that she had time in her day, every day, for her children to be able to come in and talk to her. She would always have her door open, that if any child needed to come and talk to her or even just needed a snuggle, she would be there for them. Well, as Amy wrote and wrote and wrote, she had two criteria that she always stuck by in all of her writings. The first one is that she would only write what was truthful. As I said, many of Amy's books that she wrote had to do with the stories of the children that would come to her. And when she would send those stories back to the publishers in England or in Ireland, oftentimes they would write back and say, "Can you soften this up a little bit? It's a little harsh. Can you make this story have a happy ending? Or can you not go into so many details over here? We don't want the readers to be depressed." But Amy was committed to telling the people things as they were. That's actually the title of one of her books, Things as They Are. She was not going to bend on being truthful and accurate about all that she was experiencing, all that God was doing, and the true stories of the children that were being entrusted to her. The second criteria that Amy had for everything that she wrote down was that it had to have the seed of eternity. Amy said this, "Nothing is worthwhile if the seed of eternity be not in it." The last years of Amy's life were just riddled with pain and disease. And in those last years, she actually asked one of the men that was on her staff if he could cut a cross for her out of black poster paper, which he did. And she ended up hanging that cross at a place in her bedroom where she could see it at all times. When the pain became too intense or her exhaustion, she felt like she was going to be overwhelmed by it, Amy would look upon the cross, and in her words, she would remind herself of pain far greater than mine. It was that motivation that pushed her past the pain and the suffering that she was experiencing to continue to be a productive servant of God. In the second week of January 1951, Amy actually slipped into a coma from which she never awoke. By this time, the Donover Fellowship had 900 people in it between the children and the staff. And at this point, the fellowship was also accepting boys. So there were little boys and little girls that all deeply loved their Amma. As she slipped into that coma, they ended up bringing in small groups of the fellowship to come and say their last goodbyes. In a letter, it was one of the last letters that Amy ever dictated, she wrote, "I'm very happy and content. Green pastures are before me, and my Savior has my treasure." Even until that very last moment, she had her eyes set on eternity and what it was going to be like when she looked upon her Savior's face for the first time. On January 18th, 1951, our Heavenly Father reached down and ushered Amy through those gates of eternity. He ushered her from her beloved Donover, which she had now served so faithfully for 45 years of her life, and he brought her to her eternal home. On the day that she died, the bells at Donover Fellowship rang out a song that she had requested they play when she died, that she had set her own words to. And these are the words. "One thing I have desired, my God, of thee, that I will see thee, thine house be home to me. Thou with thy child at home with thee. O Lord my God, I love, I worship thee." Amy's body was buried in the garden at Donover Fellowship, and she had made her staff and her children promise her that they would not give any special treatment to her body or place any headstone at her grave. But because her children and her staff loved her so much, they did what they felt was a little bit of a compromise, and they ended up placing a bird bath over the area that she is buried in. On that bird bath, they inscribed it with the word Amai, which is the Tamil word for mother. It has now been over 65 years since Amy passed on to glory, but the Donover Fellowship is still in existence today. Dedication of girls to the temple is now illegal in India. However, in every country, there are still places that desperately need the rejected or the abandoned to be cared for. And so the Donover Fellowship still exists today to be a home for girls that are in need of protection, of family, and most importantly, to be taught the Bible. 16 of Amy's 37 books are also still in print today. In fact, as a gift from our church to all of you as our guests today, you're all getting one of Amy's books. It's a book called If, and it's a book all about Christ's love, his love for us, and how his love for us should affect the way that we live. I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I did. So you see, Amy lived her entire life focused on eternity. She lived carefully, purposefully, and sacrificially, all for the glory of God. From the moment she became a Christian, she set her sight on where she was going, and nothing that didn't matter to God didn't matter to her. Amy's desire was to store up treasure in heaven. But more importantly than storing up treasure in heaven, Amy's greatest motivation for living with an eternal perspective was the thought of being reminded of the day that she would come face to face with Jesus. Amy said, "You will never regret having thrown all to the winds in order to follow your Master and Lord. Nothing will seem too much to have done or suffered when in the end we see him in the marks of his wounds. Nothing will ever seem enough." Let's pray. Dear God, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for just these beautiful women that you have brought together to enjoy a meal together, to have some time of talking and even laughing, and to hear the story of Amy Carmichael's incredible life. God, I pray that we would leave here today and not soon forget her life and her example. God, I ask that it would motivate all of us to live our life with eternity in view, knowing that our time here is so short. God, help us to be women who run hard after you and the things of you, living for that moment when we will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And God, if there's anyone here that doesn't know you today, then I pray that today would be the day of their salvation. God, I ask that there would be many women here today that turn from their sin and place their trust in you, and like Amy, live that life with eternal perspective. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.